My name is Jacob Hertz. Welcome to my presentation on the freedom of religion in the First Amendment. The first major principle in the freedom of religion is what legal definitions for religion have existed within the United States. The first of these definitions was David v. Beeson in 1890, where it defined religion as the preference to one's creator to one's view of his relations to his creator and to the obligations they impose of reverence for his being and character, and of obedience to his will. And this was a very objective standard that later in time would be found to be too restrictive. There would be too many religions that would be espoused by individuals that don't fall into this kind of category. And later, about 50 years later, in the United States v. Ballard, it changed from this objective standard to a more subjective standard, where it was based on the sincerity of religious views rather than the truth of the religion, meaning it required an analysis of whether or not the person is sincere in their faith, rather than regulating the content of their faith. And this subjective standard expanded even further in United States v. Seeger in 1965, where it removed any requirement for a belief in a supreme being. And this is the broad definition that we currently go by in the United States. Next is evaluating religious questions and the standards and tests that have been used to do that. The first of these principles was the belief action principle, and this came into play in Reynolds v. United States in 1879. As part of this principle, the Supreme Court endorsed that while the belief or the right to believe is absolute, meaning that anyone can believe whatever they please, the government still retains the authority to regulate people's actions and how they act on their beliefs. So in this case, where the action or the belief and action that was being questioned was polygamy among members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints out in the frontier west of the United States. And the court determined that polygamy was a morally questionable as well as morally reprehensible. And because of that, the government was permitted to regulate that practice, and it's currently outlawed in the United States to this day. Next was the valid secular policy test, and this basically endorsed the idea of neutrality, that any government regulation on the free exercise of religion had to apply to both religious and non-religious institutions simultaneously. This idea of neutrality slightly eroded in the Sherbert-Yoder compelling interest test, namely because as long as the government made it an argument that whatever objective or task they're trying to fulfill through a regulation, if they can simply state that it was compelling enough to infringe on the free exercise of religion, then there were circumstances to where that was permissible. This test was then replaced later with the Smith test, which reintroduced this idea of neutrality while also fixing the issues that were introduced by the compelling interest test by stating that any exceptions to the freedom of religion had to be generally applicable and unbiased, meaning that they had to apply simultaneously to both religious and non-religious institutions, just like the valid secular policy test. Next is the Religious Establishment Clause and the standards that have been created for evaluating that. The only real standard that has been actively used in the United States Supreme Court is the Lemon Test. And the first principle of the Lemon Test is that the legislation has to have a secular purpose, meaning that that legislation cannot intend at the outset to impact religion. Next is the primary effect, meaning that the primary effect of the legislation also has to be secular in nature, in that it does not inhibit or advance religion in any way. And finally, interaction. The Supreme Court had to make the determination of whether or not the legislation in question or created a situation of excessive entanglement between church and state. Next, we have alternatives to the lemon test that have been proposed. These alternatives have not been adopted by a widespread number of Supreme Court justices, and thus nothing has overtaken the lemon test as of yet. The first is non-preferentialism, meaning the United States can't adopt a nation or a national religion and endorse that religion. Next is endorsement, meaning that, and similar to the valid secular policy test, legislation should simply not endorse or inhibit religion in a more general fashion. The neutrality and private choice argument is that this is more in line with the Smith test, which is very similar to the endorsement test, in that legislation should not affect people's decisions regarding their religious choices. Next is coercion, meaning that legislation cannot coerce or encourage one religion over another through through actions like taxes that are religiously discriminatory. And then the final alternative was social conflict, in that a piece of legislation should not create conflict between religious groups. The first case surrounding the freedom of religion is Carson v. Macon back in 2022, where Maine operated a tuition assistance program. And the question that was being asked was, does Maine's tuition assistance program prohibit the use of tuition funds toward religious private schools, and does that violate the free exercise clause? And the majority decided yes, that the tuition assistance program discriminated against private schools on the basis of religion, in that religious schools were rejected from qualifying for this tuition assistance program. In dissenting opinions, Breyer and Mayor claimed that the non-religious policy was a balance or a compromise between the free exercise and establishment clauses, while Sotomayor claimed that this was an overreach of the free exercise clause, in that it overruled the establishment clause. Next is Kennedy v. Bremerton in 2022, and the question being answered was, is it a violation of the Establishment Clause to permit a school district employee to pray while in public and visible to students? The majority decided no, that due to the circumstances of the plaintiff in question, a school football coach, was praying silently and without students participating. And the Establishment Clause was considered because, as a school employee, that would make him a government actor. As well, the court had to balance the precedent that was set by Tinker v. Des Moines School District. And what was basically stated is that the coach prayed at a time when teachers were allowed to conduct any business at the time, and there were no students that were invited to participate in that prayer. And so the Supreme Court made the argument that there was no Establishment Clause considerations that need to be made, and therefore the act of a school district prohibiting a teacher from praying or an employee from praying in this way was an infringement of the Free Exercise Clause. And in dissent, the dissenting judges stated that simply praying in public view at a football game may present a coercive influence towards students. Finally, in Groff v. DeJoy in 2023, a USPS employee wanted to take Sundays off due to religious considerations. And the question being answered was the USPS's undue burden claim sufficient to justify firing Groff due to his refusal to work Sundays due to a religious belief? In a unanimous decision, the court said that no, based on Title VII, an employer must prove that granting a religious-based accommodation would result in a substantially increased costs to justify firing the employee. USPS was unable to fulfill the Title VII requirement, and firing Groff resulted in a violation of the Free Exercise Clause. Thank you for listening.